Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this 8th edition of the Global Pensions Program. It is a really pleasure having you with us today. Buenos días de nuevo, gracias por venir a esta 8ª edición del Global Pensions Program. Es un verdadero placer tenerles a todos ustedes con nosotros. Before we start, I would like to go over a few technical issues. Since presentations will be in English or Spanish, for the participants who wish to hear the interpretation, you will find an icon at the bottom of your screen that says Interpretation. If you click on this icon, you will have the option to choose the language. Lo repito en español, los presentadores hablarán en inglés o en español, y para quienes deseen escuchar la interpretación, como antes comenté, hay un icono en la parte inferior de sus pantallas donde pone interpretación. Pinchando el icono podrán seleccionar el idioma. During the presentation this morning, your cameras and microphones will be off. You can send your questions to Q&A. Since we might receive many questions, we apologize in advance for not being able to respond to all of them. We will include as many questions as time allows us. And before we move forward, however, we would like to know who is in the room with us. A question will pop up on your screen right now, asking you about the role that each of you are playing in your country. And please take a minute to answer these questions. We are looking forward to your answers. Para aquellas personas, porque la encuesta está en inglés, para aquellas personas que hablen español, las preguntas son: trabajo para el sector público, trabajo para el sector privado, es la B, la C es trabajo para la academia, la D es trabajo para un think tank o una ONG, la E es trabajo para una organización internacional y la F es soy estudiante. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for answering the question. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Peter Diamond. Professor Diamond is a 2010 Nobel laureate. He's an institute professor emeritus at MIT, where he taught from 1966 to 2011. He first consulted to US Congress about Social Security reform in 1974. He has analyzed pension systems in many countries. His books include Reforming Pensions, Principles and Policy Choices and Pension Reform, a short guide, both with Nicholas Barr, of which I have had the honor of translating into Spanish, and Saving Social Security, a Balanced Approach with Peter Orszag. He has been a president of the American Economic Association, of the Econometric Society, and of the National Academy of Social Insurance. Once again, I invite you to ask your questions through this webinar by sending them via the Q&A session. After the presentations, I will read them to the presenter. I would also like to let you know that the sessions will be recorded and made available as a video file on the program's website in the following days. So, Professor Diamond, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that kind introduction, but I've got to begin by commenting on the array of backgrounds of people, because when I filled out that form, I didn't see an option for describing yourself as retired. Now, I left academia 10 years ago, but I find pensions are such an interesting program that my hobby is working with Nicholas Barr on writing another book on pensions. So now let me turn, I'm not sure how to get my PowerPoints up on the screen, share screen, that must be it. No, yes. Okay. So let's get started. It's not working. It's not going page down. Anyone know what I need to do to make the PowerPoint work?
Please click on the PowerPoint play first.
Brilliant. I have an age-appropriate ability with computers. So I want to start with a touch of vocabulary. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the defined contribution, defined benefit, traditional vocabulary. What I want to do is say a couple of words about the difference traditionally as a lead into talking about hybrids, because hybrids are really what my talk will be about. So defined contribution plan, at least in the accumulation phase, is fully funded. A defined benefit plan, the extent of funding is a choice variable. In terms of annuitization, a defined contribution plan may end up with annuitization, may not. It may have mandatory annuitization. It may have voluntary annuitization. A defined benefit plan, the earnings history or contribution history triggers a set really of contracts, which are, of course, annuities. The timing of annuitization then is very different. In the defined contribution plan, you accumulate assets, and then at some point in time, if you're annuitizing, you either purchase an annuity from an insurance company, or possibly there are internal to the plan annuitization rules. With defined benefit on a rolling basis, you're building up a claim for some kind of annuity with indexing determining what kind. Rolling annuitization has the advantage that it doesn't focus so much on interest rates at a single point in time when you switch from accumulating to retiring. And then in terms of who bears the underlying risk around the financing availability, with a defined contribution plan, it's the workers. In principle, the sponsor of a defined benefit plan would be on the hook for fulfilling the contracts. And of course, there's a background of a country's politics and a country's bankruptcy rules behind that. Hybrids, of which I'm just tossing out names at this point, come with a variety of names, and they mix these different aspects between defined contribution and defined benefit. So there are many issues that would be relevant for exploring defined benefit plans, far more than I could cover in the time available. in a couple of years when our book comes out, I've recommended to you. But what I want to do is focus just on primarily two issues about adapting hybrid plans over time, which is using indexes of either statistics or projections to automatically be making annual changes in the pension plan. So we have a long history of doing that using price indices and using wage indices. And I will say a bit about some subtleties around both of those. And we have a limited amount of experience in using demographic variables and using a report of the financial balance of the plan as ways of doing automatic indexing. And I'll say a bit of that. And when you come into talking about financial balancing, obviously the planned role for funding frames what's available for the indexing to carry on. So let me start with the most familiar. Once benefits are in payment, it is common that they be increased year by year. And a common way of doing that is with a price change. It's done, for example, in Canada, in France, and in the US. What I want to talk about is what price index to use. So this is a part of ongoing debate in the US. The nature of the political debate takes the form that the legislation in 1972, which introduced price indexing of benefits, specified that the consumer price index for urban wage earners and clerical workers would be the index used. And this index is collected regularly, and it's based on getting price information from retailers. Right now, US Social Security is not on the agenda, but it pops up from time to time. And not surprisingly, the different political parties have different attitudes toward what to do for a price index. So this is proposed legislation from a couple of years ago when the Republicans controlled the House of Representatives, and the chairman of the Social Security Subcommittee of House Ways and Means wanted to change from the CPIW to what's called a chain CPI, which is something that pays more attention to the ability of consumers to make substitutions in response to relative price changes, and so tends to give smaller benefit increases year after year. Not surprising, that was on the agenda of the Republican Party. Recognizing that some people would survive a long time after their benefits start, and that this was cutting benefits relative to existing law, it was proposed that after you'd experienced this for 20 years, there would be a benefit increase. In contrast, the ranking Democrat on the committee wanted to switch from the CPI for workers for the CPI for the elderly. That normally goes up faster than the other CPI, in part because of the kind of products the elderly do. Obviously, with the price information coming from retailers, we weren't seeing the actual choices of the elderly, but rather from surveys, you would take a different weighted sum of the price indexes, weighted average of the price indexes for different commodities based on what the survey showed that the elderly consume, rather than what the general population concludes. This has been a hot topic in the US. One academic committee proposed using the CPI minus 1% on the grounds that the measurement of quality increases was not adequate. That's a way of cutting benefits. We can think of this as larger or smaller, but I think it's also from a research and policy point of view, useful to think of it in a break-even context, saying how much would you like to be increasing benefits in payment if the cost of that was coming out of the initial benefit level. So the US, this was for a period a hot topic, and the national academies came together to put up a panel of academics, a terrific panel, I can say that since I wasn't on it. And they explored the issues of what price indices to use and what purpose. They brought out the point that a cost of goods index is the cost of buying the same thing repeatedly. A cost of living index is meant to preserve a utility level for some sort of preferences that are given. So recognizing that substitution will permit less of an impact on utility than the impact on the cost of buying the particular bundle of goods you had before. Now, there are two major aggregation issues that come up when you want to do that. One is that I've already alluded to, how much that different groups have different living costs. But the second issue is to what extent you want to look at this at an individual basis and aggregate, which is referred to as a democratic index. So assume you have a representative of each decile among the elderly, and a median preference or an average preference for each decile, and you find the CPI increase for each decile, and then you average them weighting each decile with the same weight. In contrast, the way the published CPI works is it's based on aggregate consumption. And since rich people consume more than poor people, it gives their cost of living issues more weight. And so this has been referred to as a plutocratic index. One can think of doing that in different ways, staying within price indices. Another major issue is what to do about the quality of goods purchased. Some of it is simple to adjust for. Some of it is rather subtle. And there is an underlying issue of the extent to which you really do want to pay attention to quality indices. So first, let me give you an example from sales of new cars. Sometimes there are a set of options that are available that you could buy, and the price index will include that as part of the consideration to the extent that they are purchased. And then the following year, something that were options before can become included in the basic package. And so you no longer have an option, you're buying it whether you want it or not. So for somebody who wants to buy it, that's an accurate measure against the previous year if you included the price of the option. For somebody who wouldn't have bought it, it's a decrease in quality, and doing what is done in the US to produce the CPI is in fact a bad measure for those people. So problems come up in judging quality in a variety of ways once we recognize the heterogeneity in the population. I don't know about you, but my use of my cell phone, which is extensive, makes very little use of many of the advances compared to the cell phone I had before it got too old and had to be replaced. So the issue of what to do about these increases, to what extent the benefit level should be adjusted, is particularly an issue around medical care. Measured by the quality of what's available for treating disease and chronic conditions, we get huge improvements in medical care, and a fraction of increases in life expectancy are attributed to the improved quality of medical care being provided. So the issue is, should we adjust the part of the CPI coming from medical care to reflect the impact on lifetime utility from an increase in life expectancy? If we did that, we would be saying that if you're going to live longer on your Social Security benefits, you should have a lower benefit because you're living longer because healthcare has just improved. That doesn't seem to me to fit with the logic of what we are trying to do in setting up Social Security systems that adjust the benefits over time. So pure prices, that's one example, but there are a host of different examples. Finland does a mix of prices and a wage index, as does Switzerland. The underlying idea I take to be that if the economy is growing as we have experienced on average, and as we anticipate continuing, pandemic notwithstanding, then the elderly should be allowed to somewhat keep pace with the workers in terms of living standards. And one way of doing it would be a weighted average of prices and wages. Italy does indexing progressively, with lower pensions getting a larger boost, reflecting perhaps the idea that cost of living goes up more. Norway uses wages, but minus a fixed factor. And Sweden does the same. They use different factors. The Swedish one was chosen to reflect the projection of real wage growth. So this was a way of approximating a price increase, but keeping in step with the wage index, which is driving both the contributions and the other rules in the Swedish NDC. Germany uses a wage index and has introduced adjustments in the wage index, and I will get back to those. So let me turn to the US, where Social Security makes many uses of the average wage index. And it's interesting to consider the question of whether the same index should be used for all of these changes. And just to give you an example of why you might consider doing something different, here's a graph of average and median wages in the US, and they have moved at quite a different pace. So what that has meant is the use of the average index in the determination of initial benefits has, for a median worker, meant a larger boost than kept pace with median earnings. On the other hand, inequality in earnings in the US has increased greatly. So the fraction of total earnings that are below the maximum subject to contributions, which is indexed to the average wage, has been shrinking. And part of the financial difficulties of US Social Security indeed comes from the increased inequality of wages, meaning less of the wage bill is showing up in contributions, particularly from the group, given that the US has a progressive benefit formula, who are getting less back for their contributions than lower earners. Another use of indexing is benefit eligibility. So that shows up in two ways. I'm no longer obviously talking about the wage index. There's an earliest eligibility age, which says in the US, you can claim benefits at 62. And then there's an age for full benefits. There's an age that's part of the benefit formula. Some countries, like the US, have two separate ages that are in the formulas. Some countries, like the NDC countries, don't have two separate ages. They just have one earliest age. If you have just one earliest age and you increase that with life expectancy, then you're reducing costs and reducing access to benefits, assuming that the benefit at the earliest age is what it would have been before. In contrast, if you have an age for full benefits, increasing the age for full benefits is just decreasing benefits, as I will demonstrate in a moment. But now, increasing the earliest eligibility age, if you have roughly actuarially fair adjustment of benefits for the age at which you claim, something that does not contribute to overall finances. People are getting benefits a year later, but they're larger if your system includes an actuarial adjustment relative to the age for full benefit. With an age for full benefit, however, the benefit you get when you claim depends on the relationship of when you claim to the age for full benefit. So up until the 1983 legislation in the US, the age for full benefit was 65, had been from the beginning and stayed there. What was done in 83 was to say, not we will index this age to life expectancy, but reflecting the costs associated with increasing life expectancy. Down the road, in the next century actually, we will slowly increase the age for full benefits from 65 to 67. But the formula for determining your benefit at the age for full benefits was kept the same. So if you claim at 65, when the age for full benefits is 65, you get 100% of what that formula shows up. But if you claim at 65, when the age for full benefits is 67, you have to wait until 67 to get 100% of the formula. And if you claim at 65, you get a smaller benefit. These bars reflect the actual law in the US. So you could see roughly a 20%, roughly little less than a 20% benefit cut, more or less across the board, but not exactly so. So in a system like the US, increasing the age for the full benefit, full retirement age, it's also often called, is a way of just reducing the benefit formula. It is not something that necessarily has anything to do with the age at which you retire. Increasing the early eligibility age obviously affects the average age at which people are retiring. So let me turn to the Netherlands as an example of indexing on the early entitlement age in a system which is a non-contributory benefit. Everybody who's been there their whole lives gets the same benefit, and that had been set at 65. And the fact that it was above the poverty line meant the elderly in the Netherlands who had been there the whole time were receiving a benefit in excess of the official poverty line. But the Dutch decided this was too expensive to sustain on that way, and also with people having longer life expectancy, and that to a great extent being a healthy life expectancy, it was reasonable to expect people to work somewhat longer, to be somewhat less dependent upon the non-contributory benefit. So they first decided they're going to do it automatically based on life expectancy. They second decided that people should get advance notice of when their individual benefit will kick in, and they thought 5 years in advance was a good way to know. So for the first 5 years after the law was passed, the law included specific ages. But after that, then further increases would be linked to increases in life expectancy. So this is something targeted on the cost of a part of the overall pension system, designed to hold costs down relative to the growth of available revenues. The actual benefit level itself is indexed, but here I'm just focusing on a demographic part. So now I want to turn to the notional defined contributions, which I'm assuming everybody is familiar with. It has its name because it follows some of the rules of a defined contribution pension. And it says notional because it's not necessarily funded. And so rather than a rate of return on actual assets driving the pension system, there's an index chosen for driving that. And Sweden has chosen the average wage as the notional interest rate to be used for this purpose. So what happens here is, and Sweden did not at the same time index the earliest age you could claim. So a notional defined contribution pension is one of the hybrids I referred to, or you can think of it as a defined contribution plan that isn't funded and has to substitute for the kind of information coming from funding. Or you can think of it as a defined benefit plan that has in it some automatic indexing for life expectancy. Those are two ways of describing the same thing. So notional defined contribution plan takes your contributions each year and blows them up by the notional interest rate rather than the return on assets until you reach claiming age. And then that accumulation is converted into an initial benefit based on life expectancy. But there's also an issue of how you treat past earnings. In Sweden, as I've said, it is average earnings. In France, there's a point system for part of the complex French system, and they take past earnings and they bring them up by prices. In Finland, they use a mix of prices and earnings, a different mix than they use for adjusting benefits and payment. In Latvia, where there's a notional defined contribution system, they recognize that the revenues coming in from contributions, from the taxes on earnings, relate to total earnings, or total earnings up to the limit that's covered. It doesn't relate to average earnings. So in Latvia, the index being used in the notional defined contribution is the growth of aggregate earnings, not the growth of average earnings. The idea is to have a closer fit between contributions, between revenues and expenditures to keep sustainability. In Sweden, with an anticipated not just decrease in the growth of the labor force, but possibly shrinking labor force, there will be financial difficulties down the road from the particular way they're being indexed. So I mentioned life expectancy. In Germany, they use the dependency ratio, the account of the set of workers making contributions relative to the set of retirees getting benefits. And so it's that focus on the annual contributions relative to the annual expenditures is used to adjust the value of a point in the German point system. And so there's automatic indexing for demography to help keep the system in balance. Another way to go, this other than demography per se, I will skip over Sweden, which has an adjustment based on a life cycle calculation, but not an actual projection of financial balance, but rather a demographic calculation used as part of an interest calculation. Just as life expectancy, when you convert that for an annuity, you're taking a present discounted value. The other way to go would be to pay attention to financial balance. So let me review now some additional demographic changes. The German case I've just mentioned. The gross wage gets adjusted both for changes in the contribution rate and for changes in the dependency rate. The US discussion has a 75-year projection playing a central role in the political process and the general public discussion. So a proposal that I made together with Peter Orszag in the book that was cited at the start was to build in some automatic change for life expectancy, but to do it built around the financial balance issue. The idea here is each year, as the Office of the Actuary projects for 75 years, one of the things that changes is life expectancy. The mortality table gets adjusted, and part of the change in the cost of providing benefits over the next 75 years comes from a change in mortality. And we propose that this should be divided evenly between a change to be phased in of benefit levels for all future retirees and a change in contribution rates for all ongoing labor. And the idea behind this was, with increasing life expectancy, we do expect increasing ability to work. If everything were blown up proportionally, we could keep a constant ratio between work years and retirement years and expectation and preserve financial balance. Our thinking was that as you age, your ability to work doesn't keep pace in full with life expectancy. There's more than just health that is an issue for your labor market opportunities in your 60s and after. And so the proposal was the way an individual would optimally respond to awareness of greater life expectancy would be to adjust all three of consumption before retirement, consumption after retirement, and length of work. And by adjusting all three to approximate that, you have to increase the contribution rate along with decreasing the benefit rate. So it was a proposal to build on both of those. Sweden, as I mentioned, does a demographic-based calculation resembling a projection. And what is interesting is it uses that not just to adjust benefits and payment already, but also to adjust future initial benefits because the notional interest rate that's used not only to adjust benefits and payment, but also to adjust the way you convert an earnings record into a claim for an initial benefit, the notional interest rate matters there. A lower notional interest rate means lower initial benefits from the accumulation in a defined contribution vocabulary. So they were spreading the life expectancy issue across both workers and retirees, and they were doing the calculation for a given year, so it was looking across cohorts. It was a period life expectancy, not a cohort life expectancy. And as a period life expectancy, it's looking at everybody who's in the system at the time. So how does the Swedish system work? They describe it in the vocabulary of defined contribution. They have a ratio of assets to liabilities, lagged a bit for data availability, but they don't project life expectancy. They do it off the current picture. And they also look at, as an asset, the amount of contributions that current workers will be making if in the future their experience is like the cross-section. So we're using the cross-section as if it were the future. And then you can count a ratio of assets to liabilities. And if assets are less than liabilities, then the notional interest rate is to be reduced. Initially, they were going to reduce it in full to deal with that problem, but that set off a political storm the first time it got invoked, and they decided to smooth it out by having only 1/3 of what was needed kick in any year, so it might kick in a couple of times. So the balance index is used rather than the income index in doing this. And so both pensions in payment and pension balances don't grow as fast as they would have without this calculation. If, after having done balancing, the system grows back more strongly, then some of this can be undone. Of course, you're undoing it for the accumulations, and for the retirees who are still around, it's not something to deal with the lost or lower previous benefits. The other thing I want to talk about, also coming from Sweden, is how their mandatory defined contribution system called the premium pension works. This is 2.5% of payroll that goes into a choice of assets that gets accumulated till retirement, at which point the only way it can be taken is as an annuity. And they have actually two different ways that you can choose to have your annuity. One of them is like a with-profit life insurance company would do, and I don't want to talk about that because that would get us into the bowels of how the life insurance companies make their adjustments. The other option they have is for the set of people who, in a single year birth cohort, who choose this option, they will get a benefit based on their accumulation. And when they die, what's left in their accumulation gets given to the other people in their birth cohort who are still alive. The flip is, you as a retiree are getting inheritance gains in their vocabulary. They also have to calculate how much you get each year as a benefit, which they refer to as an annuity divisor. It's done to say, if you have life expectancy, this is the amount you would take out now. That would be a sensible amount relative to your life expectancy. And then the next year, they will recalculate based on two things: the extent to which your asset values have gone up and the extent to which you've had inheritance gains. Now, I refer to this as a tontine, which has been named for Lorenzo di Tonti, who was born in 1602 and died in 1684, and proposed this, and it became an investment option, primarily a way for government to be borrowing at better interest rates than were available to the government otherwise. So a simple tontine has a group of investors who each buy a share of, say, a government bond, paying a certain amount each year for 20 years. And those annual returns are received by the group of investors and are divided up in proportion to how much they invested, only among the ones who are still alive. So it is a way of sharing the life expectancy risk within a cohort. Done as an investment, it was done in the name of somebody who wasn't necessarily the owner, unlike the Swedish pension. So clever investors would name a healthy young woman as somebody very likely to live the entire time and get the return on the investment. And I suspect, although I haven't seen mention of it, they would probably have several such people in order to spread the risk over multiple lives. So let me briefly talk about pay-as-you-go funding. The Dutch AOW I mentioned has basically none. While there is a revenue source that is nominally for the AOW, that's part of the political process of generating a particular tax, and it's just part of general revenues and comes out of general revenues. The Sweden incomes pension, which is the one I've talked about with balancing the notional defined contribution, views the need to have enough fund to be adequate for a recession. The US in 1983 wanted to build a fund particularly focused on the baby boomers, so the fund would grow to several trillions and then be run down to keep the financing as the baby boomers were retiring. So unlike countries that didn't build up funding, the baby boomers hitting retirement caused immediate financing problems. In the US, we have absolutely a financing problem, but it is delayed because of this adjustment. Giving time to do something, although nothing has been done since 1983 of any significance. And the Canada Pension Plan decided it wanted to build up funding as part of intergenerational equity. It wanted the extent to which the generosity to the earlier generations, some already dead, to be spread over the future, that was to be spread over the future, and additional growth would come on a fully funded basis. US legislative history, I'm going to skip over because I described it. There is the way the US lack of automatic indexing means that when we hit the point that the trust fund is zero, everybody's benefit gets cut by roughly 20%. Not a good way to run a pension system. In Canada, the idea is that the contributions will build a fund to cover 20 to 25% of annual expenditures, the rest coming in the pay-as-you-go way. And insofar as they expand the system, that expansion would be done on a fully funded basis, in the sense that the benefits being paid out would slowly grow based on the length of time there's been an accumulation. They have an investment board separate from the pension plan, separate from the government to do the investing, hoping that, and so far succeeding in having it well funded. And every 3 years, the chief actuary asks whether the contribution rate will sustain the system in two senses. One, it won't run out of money for 75 years. And the other, the ratio of the fund to expenditures 60 years out would be as large as the one 10 years out. And if that fails, then for the next 3 years, there'll be an increase in the contribution rate and a lack of a cost of living adjustment. So that is, to my mind, an area we need serious research on to explore and develop going forward as we make more use of automatic adjustments, more use of demography, and also in a country where you have reliable projections, where the political process will respect it, it would be handy to have some automatic adjustments there to not rely on periodic and sometimes crisis-driven responses. Just as a general proposition, one of the things I like about the US Actuary's Office and the system as a whole is the repeated calling for individual academic panels to review aspects of how they project the future and how they think about the future. And there are a series of reports that I recommend to you for the content. And as mentioned at the start, if you don't want to wait a couple of years till Nick and I have our next book available, you can look at the old one. Thank you.
You're welcome, Peter. We have received a lot of questions. And just let me check some of them in order to take advantage of the few minutes that we have. One of them is, in a context where increasing the retirement age is a public policy objective to catch up with longevity increases, for example, which considerations one may have when comparing an increase in the legal retirement age versus providing incentives, say, for instance, actuarial or even higher than actuarial gains via subsidies?
Okay, so this goes back to the session where the slide where I drew the distinction between an earliest eligibility age, a time at which you can claim, and an age that's part of the benefit formula. If you change the age that's part of the benefit formula, that cuts benefits. What it does to the actual retirement behavior, the average age at which people retire, is unclear, because primarily from that, what we're seeing is an income effect. If we change the first age, the impact of that on finances depends upon the extent to which there are actuarial adjustments. While encouraging later, more work and later claiming is good, I think it's important to keep in mind two aspects of it. One is the financial aspect, which is not just the impact on the benefit level, but also the presence of additional contributions. So if we're going to talk about actuarially fair, we want to talk about that combination. The second thing to recognize, however, is the ability to go on working. The presence of adequate options is stochastic. And we want to think of that as something for which we're providing some degree of insurance. So I think if you calculate actuarially fair appropriately, the increase should be somewhat smaller than that, not somewhat larger, to recognize the risk factor and provide some insurance. So I think more contributions earlier, lower benefits later, that should be part of the package, and encouraging more work. Obviously, a system that has little or no increase in benefits for continuing past the earliest eligibility age is doing a very bad job of encouraging the right amount of work for the financial implications. So the first thing you want to do is you do want to get those into a sensible place, but that alone is not going to be enough. It's given the magnitude of the problems we're facing, some mix of delaying the benefits and reducing will be part of it. And whether you also want to increase contributions as part of this response depends upon the particular circumstances of a country. In the US, where we have a very low contribution rate by international standards and low benefits by international standards, the contribution rate increase should absolutely be part of it. In countries that have high contribution rates and conclude they don't want to increase them anymore, then that option goes away. And what's left are the other two, the increase in the age of claiming and the decrease in the level of benefits. And I think it's important to keep in mind that insofar as you have gotten actuarial, then the getting someone to work more is not a large contribution. And the set of people who are claiming at the first stage may have rather different life expectancies than the people who are claiming later. This is well documented in US Social Security. The people who claim at 62 have noticeably shorter life expectancy than people claiming later. And as everyone is familiar by things like education and earnings levels, life expectancies vary significantly in the population, and that variation has been growing for several decades. And I see no reason to think that process will change in the near future. So this is something that obviously has to be addressed, but I think one needs to pay attention to the fact you can't think about this well in the context of a representative agent.
Thank you, Peter. Time expires, but we like to take advantage to have you here with us. So go on with other more questions, if you don't mind. It says, in your opinion, is it more political viable to change the indexation of benefits than the retirement age or the contribution rate?
The political side of it. Well, first of all, politics are dramatically different country by country. I'm learning this as a member of the French Commission. The politics in France around pensions is very different from that in the US. We haven't had any strikes about pension changes. On the other hand, we haven't gotten any changes. France has gone through a series of adjustments that the US put in place in '83 without benefit cuts until decades later. And when those rolled in, it was barely noticed. I mean, that's part of the beauty of automatic adjustments. Once you have them in place, they're the background, they're the wallpaper. They're not something you take to the streets over. What will happen in the US if in a decade, the Social Security Trust Fund will be empty and everybody will get a 20% benefit cut? I think, judging from recent experience, people will take to the streets And they will be the older, not the younger, but it will be supported broadly. So I can talk about US politics. I don't talk about French politics. And I think it's going to be different country by country. And the role of a government that has earned trust from the people by having a careful and visible process of dealing with pension issues is going to enhance the ability to have more sensible designs.
Okay, thank you. I think we can have another more question, Peter. Just one, just one more. In an NDC system, during the accumulation period, in general, the amount in the pensions account is adjusted for GDP or average earnings. In comparison with the DC plans, is it riskier in terms of low returns, considering possible low GDP in the medium term? Which variable in that case do you consider the best option to adjust the values?
The risk issue is quite complex because if you have a funded system, you have the risk of the returns on the assets, and you have the risks of the political process that goes with a funded system. Without getting specific, sometimes the funds that are accumulated in a DC system are taken by the government for other purposes. Sometimes they're replaced by just government debt. Sometimes they're not replaced at all. So there are both rate of return risks and political risks there. If you have an NDC system, then you will have some funding. You wouldn't want none. And there'll be some asset risk, but much less. And you still have the political issue of how the government responds to what happens in growth. So if, as with Latvia, you're really relating benefits to contributions, you can have hands off and you can talk about the risk associated with growth. And the catch here is it depends what kind of horizon you have. At different stages, we're all familiar with the life cycle investment thought that you want to be moving to less risky assets as you're nearing retirement. But if you're, on the other hand, going to annuitize, you want to be moving to the assets that are going to hedge the price of annuities. So I think this is not a simple, here's one time series rates of return on total assets. Here's another time series rate of growth of GDP or an average wage. Which of these has more variation? Long run, the trouble is we know the asset returns fluctuate a lot more in the short run, and the length of horizon of different people varies. So I think you need a analysis that I don't have at my fingertips. So basically, I'm not answering the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, time is over. Peter, it has been a really honor for me to introduce, to present you today. Thank you very much for coming us and join us in this program, and see you soon. And we are going to go on in 20 minutes with Professor Nicholas Bach. See you in 20 minutes then. Thank you very much.